One policy is called mowing the lawn. And what this means is that every now and then, Israel, Zionist entity, goes and inflicts massacres on the people of Gaza, called mowing the lawn. Mowing the lawn because if the lawn overgrows, it has to be mowed, you have to cut the grass. And this is how they see the people of Gaza. Now, of course, the people who are in a blockade and you're cutting off their water, electricity, or controlling it, and their fuel and their food, one day the people would, of course, take to resistance. They would try the peaceful method, like for example the peaceful March to Britain some years back, where people all traveled together to the borders peacefully, but they were shot dead. More than 200 people died in that situation, were killed. They shoot at people, at kids' kneecaps, staple them for life. These peaceful methods that they've tried. And then of course when you have a resistance, it's now time for mowing the lawn.
Welcome to What's Left, a weekly political discussion challenging the mainstream left. I'm Eduardo Barca, all the way from Mexico City, with co-host, teacher and socialist Andy Lipson from Oakland, California. We're online at Whatsleftpodcast.com. You can find that link to our site in the episode notes. You can also find my personal social media handle as at Don Eduardo Barca. Please subscribe, rate, review, turn on your notifications, and share your favorite episode wherever you found this episode. We have merch as well. If you fancy a shirt, contact us through our site at whatsleftpodcast.com. That's whatsleftpodcast.com. Thank you. All right, Michael Hoffman, you are becoming a regular. I'm going to have to mention you at the very beginning of every intro from now on, it feels like. Michael Hoffman, socialist and community college maths professor, not one math, but many maths professor, and former ISO comrade of Andy Lipson. Thank you again for joining us.
Hey, glad to do it. Glad to be here.
Good. All right, let's get into it. We are on a Saturday, which is rare for us. Mm-hmm. And on this Saturday evening, what are we discussing, Andy?
Well, this is in some ways a part two to last week's episode entitled Ceasefire Delusions, which took up a number of ceasefire things, the one in Ukraine, but also the recent collapse of the ceasefire between Gaza, in Gaza, which had Israel reattacking the Palestinians in Gaza as opposed to just in the West Bank. Although I just have to say it, they had continued to attack Palestinians in Gaza. They're just accelerating the attack. There was never quite a ceasefire for Palestinians anywhere, actually. And one of the things that Michael had brought up, or we had started talking about, was this question of resistance and Hamas. And you know, Eduardo, in previous episodes, I was starting to be like, is Hamas even a resistance movement? Like, you know, in light of the position they had taken around Syria and seeming to support HTS almost, or at least saying, hey, welcome HTS, maybe we can be friends kind of thing in Syria. And then, of course, you know, the claims of them being, you know, kind of being on the payroll of Israel, which is, there's truth to that. I mean, definite truth to that. And then in relationship to October 7th, that maybe they're just literally a wing of the Israeli state almost, you know, so they're not resistance then or something like that. So I was getting myself kind of confused about that. And Michael did not seem as confused. And so I said, like, I want to talk about this. And he sent us an article. I want to show that. I'm going to share it on the screen with it right now. Which he used as sort of the kind of a centerpiece around which we'll be discussing today, which is an article posted in Marxist Left Review, Hamas, a Marxist Appraisal, written by Omar Hassan, who I believe is a socialist located in Australia. So I want to talk about Hamas as resistance, is Hamas the resistance group? What do we say about resistance? Because that's a big question, as people keep getting called terrorists for supporting Hamas, and anti-Semites for supporting Hamas, or supporting the right to resistance, whatever that. I mean, we'll talk about that. And then I want to talk about some of the things that I thought were good about this article. And then for me, I'm very familiar, both me and Michael as socialists are very familiar with articles written like this. And I've got deeper questions about it now. And I want to talk with that. I want to talk about some of those deeper questions, regardless of some of the things I liked about it, about whether or not is this the kind of stuff that's actually useful to even write ultimately. So I hope we get to that, but I think there's an order I want to touch on things. So that that's a rough nutshell of what I hope to talk about today.
All right, good. So I guess how should we carry on?
Well, actually, if you want, you just laid out a kind of outline. I guess I want to start with the question of, is Hamas just a wing of the Israeli state? Like, are they actually what they say they are? Yeah, I just want to say that a lot of people, on the left share this kind of knee jerk, like, oh, Hamas is terrible. They're just, they, um, they're brutal, and you're almost everyone is supposed to go like, ooh, Hamas is bad, and so I had this question on my mind: is Hamas a psyop? And I was like, well, the biggest psyop has been, I think decades of making anybody who doesn't speak English, right? So people who speak Arabic, or people who practice Islam seem like, less than human barbarian people. Like that is the biggest psyop, right? So even just images of a Hamas fighter with a keffiyeh faster wrapped around their face is supposed to invoke like, oh no, something just so terrible, right? And I think it was the war on terror, when the war on terror and then the invasion of Iraq, when I learned, oh, actually the most brutal people are the ones who tell me who to hate, right? The most brutal people are the U.S. state who, and the Israeli state who, are so dishonest, right? Like, they are such liars. And so the idea that somehow Hamas is on some even worse level or even on the same plane of evilness, just I have to reject it outright. Because if I even if you just remove like the affect, right? Like remove all of the sort of emotion from how you evaluate these two different groups, you just count up the bodies and it's not even close. I mean, just count up the bodies. I mean, the invasion, like Vietnam, they destroyed Vietnam, the invasion and occupation of Iraq, and that's not even talking about the establishment of the state of Israel, which was founded by, slaughtering Palestinian civilians. So just on the face of it, it is such nonsense to like equate Hamas as an organization, or even like Islam, like resistance that takes an Islamic face, to be somehow inherently bad or evil. Like, I learned never to accept that premise.
Yes, I do agree. And we've said this on the show, that the biggest terrorist, not just in terms of body count, but in terms of sheer level of violence and unfairness and injustice, is the U.S. capitalist class. No one can compare to them currently. I think there's other people are vying for it. China's looking to become the top dog, and Russia is trying to get up there, but no one can defeat the U.S. in terms of the biggest bringer of terror globally. When you think about their military across the globe, it is the United States. And so to affix, and there are people who would like, oh, HTS is a terrorist group, and so that's why they're bad. It's like, dude, the people who are calling them terrorists are the biggest terrorists. I don't care whether they're on the U.S. list or the European list,
Right,
or the Canadian list. I don't care whose list they're on. The biggest, unless the top of that person is the U.S. ruling class, is Joe Biden and Barack Obama and Clinton and Trump. Unless those are the people at the top of your docket, miss me on the entire terrorist list. So I agree with you, um, so, and I think this article. But I think we have more to say about it than just. But I think that's the first starting point, which is, forget, if you're going to be worried about terrorists, then take down the U.S. ruling class. That's who has to go. Then we can, after they get taken down, we can start talking about the depth chart. But way down below, way down here, might be Hamas, might even be HTS, might even be ISIS, Al Qaeda. Way down here, you got to go through Trudeau, through Macron, through Putin, you got a ton of people to get to until you get to those creatures down there. And until you clear out that group, I'm not worried about I'm worried about the big terrorists, not the ones that the big terrorists call the terrorists, who, like we know, often are, actual resistance. Some of them I do know are CIA plants, and in that regard, they no longer constitute a resistance movement. But I won't call them terrorists. I'll just call them U.S. flunkies. I'll call them U.S. proxies, because the biggest terrorists are the U.S. capitalist class. So I agree with that. And Eduardo, do you want to say anything? Because I want to get to the article about.
The only thing I can say is I'm on another podcast suddenly. It's called Bantercast Live, and it's with my good buddy, childhood best friend, Jacob Schmidt. And I did a first episode yesterday night, and I had forgotten the pulse of people's trust and faith in U.S. American politics and the structure that it governs itself by, and the hypocrisy. And I hadn't realized, I guess maybe I've been in these episodes, in 300 plus episodes of What's Left, had forgotten what it's like to actually think about the world with that paradigm, the way they think about the world. And so as we're looking here, and I'm looking at the article, and I've got my few points, I agree with you 100%. So much of especially because I'm talking to Jacob Schmidt, so much of the emphasis is focused on drug cartels and these smaller gangs. And just rightly so, Andy, you're saying what I said last night over and over. It's like the terrorists, I'm not afraid. I mean, yes, the victims of people who have been targeted or who have experienced, ouch, I have a cat. Ouch.
Now there's a terrorist right there.
I thought you were dramatizing.
No.
Then...
Ouch. I'm so sorry. He wants to get onto my lap, and so he scratched himself up my leg to get on my lap.
See, that is unlawful violence, and your cat is now on the terrorist list.
Onyx, you are a terrorist.
So cute.
Anyhow, ouch. So, so much emphasis in U.S. American media is about the drug cartels, but I'm worried about, as I mentioned last night, I'm worried about people causing World War III, and that is all these other greater terrorists, these gangsters at the very top, and we're worried about what's happening at the border and families and terrorism. I was like, there's just no basis on what last night I spoke with Jake about that is that threatening in the world that's going to cause the destruction of that planet. It's these people who have nukes and who are going to destroy our planet because of competition that are going to destroy us. And people are worried about, competition of the sales of drugs and markets, and it has nothing to do with what we're really trying to fight. Anyhow, so yes, let's get into the article. I have a few points to mention, and just let me know when we're going to share those points.
So here's what I'll do here. So I'll just say a few things right away, and just to read. Let's see. Here's the article. Let's see. What is it? Within the broader movement, the question of Hamas looms large. For Israel and its allies, Hamas is a terrorist organization, the latest manifestation of the savagery and violence inherent in the Arab people. Let's see. He said that, and its allies, and that's like Michael said. This is the way most people think about it. Its very existence serves as a self-evident justification for Israel's most brutal actions. This argument reached its climax in the immediate aftermath of Hamas military operation on October 7th, which shook a complacent and rightward-moving Israeli society to its core. Led by a vulnerable yet tenacious Netanyahu, Israel has sought to save face by launching an unprecedented assault on the people of Gaza, ludicrously justified as self-defense. The enormous casualties and cruelties unleashed on the people of Palestine need not be described here, as they are well known and ever increasing. All this has been outrageously justified as a campaign of self-defense against Hamas. The issue of Hamas also rises in the international solidarity movement, often for opposite reasons. Many supporters of Palestine have little idea about the history politics and practices of Hamas. They are seen simply as the only group willing to resist Israeli aggression, which leads many to fall into fairly uncritical support for its actions. This article, I skipped something. This article will therefore attempt to put forward a Marxist assessment of Hamas as a political organization. Let's see if I can get to it begins by explaining. Let's see. Wait, I might have skipped the part. Oh, no, this is the most important part that I skipped. In developing an independent assessment of Hamas, we have to avoid simplistic reactions to Zionist propaganda or glorification of an abstract resistance. On the one hand, and this part I completely agree with, we absolutely defend the Palestinians' right to fight for self-determination, including with force. And then he says, but we can be critical of it. We don't have to, yet defending these essential national rights does not require us to champion whatever organization rises up to the fore at a particular time, and certainly not to defend any and every tactic employed. That part, like, again, whether I defend tactics and we can get into that. All I can say is those people have the right to resist in any way they see they need, by any means necessary. Some are going to work better than others. All I'm going to say is here in the United States, these people their land has been stolen from them. They are facing an occupation. This guy does a great job in writing this article by pointing out that they actually now are not ruled, but they're semi-ruled by the Palestinian Vichy government of the Palestinian Authority, which represents Hamas in Gaza and Fatah in West Bank. So Israel and the United States, because the United States is behind this as well, have gotten the Palestinians to essentially police their own population. So in resistance to that, people who've been robbed of their land, killed, are told where they can go and where they can't go, occupied. They have the right to do anything they need to do to resist that. And I support any and all that resistance. And I particularly support in the United States anything that makes it harder for the United States to keep its hand and its grip on the throat of populations. Anything people do to do that, I support, because that's going to make it easier for me to do my job here, which is something I want to talk about later. And so for me, I'm not sure I even trip about tactics. That's for those folks to worry about. And I make an issue of that there was a time when PLO or Hamas initially was only attacking military targets and then later went to civilian targets. I'm not all I'm saying is they have the right to resist in whatever way possible. They may find themselves doing that. If you watch that movie about Algiers, what's that French?
Battle for Algiers.
Battle for Algiers. If you watch a movie about World War II, you are going to see civilians get bombed. Civilians get attacked by resistance movements, and they're called collaborators, and some of them are not even collaborators. So look, if everyone, I'm just not going to trip on tactics, to be honest. So we can get to that maybe later, but first and foremost, full stop, right to resist by any means necessary, and they get to decide. I don't get to decide because I'm not living there. That's what I'll first say.
Yeah, and I think reading on this stuff again, the thing that that a lot of people completely leave out when they talk about Hamas or how bad Hamas is, or even on the other side, holding Hamas up as somehow flawless, is like the actual relationship of Hamas to the rest of the Palestinian movement, and the fact that the bulk of the Palestinian movement was led by secular nationalists in Fatah, who then help, or in like a Palestinian coalition called the PLO, Palestine Liberation Organization, and they were the main people doing the violence against the Israeli occupation, right? So now, like, framing it where, like, in the last few decades, we've seen mainly Hamas be the armed struggle. It's like that was not initially the case. In fact, they didn't really take up arms until the 80s because they saw the capitulation that was happening on the part of the nationalists. So, like, an interesting thing for people to understand is, like, the genocide in Gaza right now, the narrative that they're telling about how, like, we have to destroy Hamas, and we'll never have security on our borders if Hamas is in charge. They said the exact same thing about Fatah and the PLO in Lebanon in 1982. In fact, the parallels of the Israel just destroyed South Lebanon, killed tens of thousands of people, and it was very similar to the situation in Gaza now, where there was like international outcry. People were, Israel lost some credibility, right? They lost some support because they were so brutal. The whole thing was framed as they had to eliminate the PLO.
Wait, did you say
rout them.
PLO in Lebanon?
Yeah,
I didn't know about that.
yeah. Because, if we want to actually, you know what? Let's back up a little bit. The Zionist movement, and I'm going to give a thumbnail sketch of the Zionist movement. So one of the things everybody should really understand is that the Zionist movement was started by European Jews who were trying to build a capitalist base under severe anti-Semitism. The anti-Semitism was in Europe. Jews were a big scapegoat in Europe. There's lots of history as to why that was the case, but there was no like anti-Jewish pogroms in the Middle East. Like, that's not what was going on in the Middle East. So turn of the century, there's European capitalism is really growing. A section of Jewish European capitalists are like, well, where's our thing? And they start thinking about, how can we set up our own state? How can we turn Judaism, which was a religion, into a nationalist movement? And basically, around after World War One, the European world powers were like, hey, you know what? Maybe this would suit our interests to support this. Not only can we get the Jews out of Europe because they were anti-Semites, but we can also set up like a base in the Middle East where the Ottoman Empire just fell, and now we can take over the resources. So like the origins of the anti-Zionist resistance really are because when like Britain and France were basically taking over down in that region to try and control it economically, right? So like the state of Israel is essentially founded with huge European backing, and becomes essentially what the European powers see as like a buttress for Western values in the Middle East. That is, not just strategically important globally, but also like near, not just strategically important militarily, but also important economically because of the resources. Also because at that time, you have the Arab states trying to become independent, right? It's the era of emerging nations, and essentially, the Europeans were like, we want to break up any kind of unity across that region because we want to control it economically, right? So it really has nothing to do with Judaism, other than that Judaism was a very effective ideological tool for getting people to buy into it. And
as you
Islam, actually, early on, Islam is closely tied to Arab culture. It's tied to Arab language. Like, a lot of people learn Arabic through studying the Quran, but there was a plurality of different religions in the places that were Arab, right? So like, it was originally, there were lots of Jews who were Arab, like Arab speaking people who practiced Judaism in that region. And Islam is culturally related to that, even if you're not a Muslim in that region. And so as early as like the 20s, you had people who were tying Islam to essentially opposing the British and the French and the people who were coming down there to dominate them, right? And that's the birth of like the way the early Muslim Brotherhood is basically like, we need to have a modern Islam that allows us to stand up for ourselves and allows us to basically create a modern economy that isn't subject to these international powers. But like Islamic brand resistance to it was basically, very, very negligible compared to what was emerging at that time as an Arab nationalism that was tied to kind of state socialism, modeled and supported by like the Soviet Union, right? So like the point here is that the secular nationalists were really the leaders of like a real struggle. 1948, people were expelled from their houses. And I don't know, like when I read about that and I'm like, what would I do if soldiers came and kicked me out of my house and basically then also started lying all over the world about why they did it? And, I would be really angry and I would be like forever traumatized and changed and want to fight back, right? Just like I can imagine, like, can you imagine being like a young person growing up in Gaza and seeing one of the periodic mowing of the lawn and not want to like, fight these people, right? So there's always been an organic resistance to this from the beginning of, I'd say since the fall of since the turn of the century, the end of World War One, people wanted to fight back against basically being dominated by the European powers. And then they had their little super violent religious colony kick people out. And the problem is that Israel beat them back. Israel beat that, and not just Israel, I should say. Israel beat back the PLO and Fatah to a point where finally they're like, okay, fine. We're going to acknowledge you as a state. We're going to accept the existence of Israel, and we're going to start negotiating. And once you start negotiating, this is an interesting, I think, general dynamic. Once you go from, okay, we're going to overthrow you to like, okay, now we're going to try and work something out with you, then there's a certain amount of legitimacy, right? Suddenly you're at the table, just like, you have a seat at the table with the more powerful people.
Let me pause you for a second, because I think in making that transition, I don't want it to be confusing. What you're saying is, in going from a resistance movement to your occupier to saying, okay, and rejecting the fact that your occupier took your land and saying, I want my land back, and going from that position to saying, all right, occupier, I do see you have some legitimacy. I do see you have something, but give me mine too. Once you make that transition, and that's the transition the resistance movement made, and that was a historic defeat, one that actually Hamas actually made the break with PLO and Fatah in relationship to that. So that's what you're pointing to.
Right. So I guess I would say the purpose of me bringing up 1982 and then going through that whole history is that basically people were fighting back, and initially they wanted complete liberation, right? And if you can't win militarily and you don't have, huge revolution that, overthrows the ruling classes in the region and completely institutes a new thing, if you don't have actual power, then you're gonna have to decide: are you just gonna completely give up, or are you gonna try and eke out some existence for you? Are you gonna try and survive? And that's the key word. You are faced with the choice of how much are we willing to give up on our original liberatory village now to just on our original liberatory vision. How much are we going to give up of that just to survive? Right. And Hamas, was in the 80s basically like, okay, they are headed towards negotiating with the entity. They are headed towards essentially committing to putting down their guns, right? So the Hamas distinguishes itself is because while the nationalist movement was on decline, and then also selling out their people, like Oslo was a terrible, so basically the first Intifada ends, and the Intifada is like an uprising. It ends essentially with the Oslo Accord, where Arafat and his clique basically agree to like, all right, we're gonna agree to like little Bantustans, and you're gonna legitimize us. You're gonna create a Palestinian Authority that we get to basically act like we have some power and govern in these little areas you're gonna allow us to have.
Gaza, West Bank.
in Gaza and the West Bank. Yeah. So that is the beginning of when they had to start basically enforcing their deals with Israel. So as soon as you say, okay, Israel, you're going to give us this, and we're going to promise no one's going to attack you, right? In a society where people have been, resisting for a long time, what do you actually what does that require to make sure no one else goes and shoots an Israeli soldier, or shoots back at an Israeli soldier, I should say, or shoots back at Israeli settlers, or launches a rocket or whatever? How are you going to enforce that on your own people? The PA becomes essentially, and it's doing this now, it essentially becomes it becomes a wing of the Israeli state enforcing its will on the Palestinian people by making sure that all the Palestinians are falling in line behind the deal they just cut with Israel. So Mahmoud Abbas is basically, I would say, he is a total U.S.-Israeli stooge. He's basically, I would say, even that I would claim that now they've turned Fatah essentially into now essentially kind of like a proxy of the U.S. and Israeli state, and Hamas has basically developed their whole identity as being, we're not putting down our guns. Fatah was like, you got to put down your guns and we're going to actually enforce it on you. And Hamas said, no, we're not going to put down our guns. And through the process of Hamas becoming more popular, they became more legitimate and wanted a seat at the international table. But I think I've covered too much ground.
Yes.
Yeah.
So let me go backwards, because I think that's one branch. I think the other branch is the actual critiques that are made of Hamas, of their connections to the Muslim Brotherhood, that the West supported them, Israel supported them, and gave them money as part of the Muslim Brotherhood as a counterweight to those nationalist secular movements. That is entirely true. And that is entirely true that Hamas built itself out of some of the money that came from the West, in its connection in being a counterweight, and as a counterweight accepted the repression that was going to take place of those leftists and radicals and secular nationalists who were fighting the occupation. So Hamas has that history. Secondly, people will say, well, look, Netanyahu supports Hamas. Entirely true. They supported Hamas as a counterweight to PLO or Fatah, basically trying to make sure that these two states would have two different governments. Both of them would be dependent on Israel or on the West, but that they would never come together to basically create any notion of a two-state solution. Now, a two-state solution doesn't work, but Israel wasn't even willing to countenance the idea that could possibly work. So, yes, Hamas was being funded as a way of making sure it stayed independent of the other government that was located in the West Bank. So you'd have two separate Vichy governments, and Hamas made a third, I would say, mistake, if you will. It basically decided to become part of the Palestinian Authority, and by doing so, it undermined its own critique of Oslo, because its critique of Oslo was, we're giving up our guns to become essentially giving up our guns against our oppressors, to use our guns to actually against our own people, because we have to keep them in line. And in doing that, and once they accepted a seat in government, which they did, and became out of their support they got, because they were the most firm resistance that was left among the resistance that was there by the 80s and 90s. Then they essentially accepted, I think this is around 2000, they accepted a position as leadership. They were elected even as leadership of the PA in Gaza. And in many ways, that's where some of their own people become even more critical of them. And many people even see this recent act in October 7th as a means of kind of trying to resuscitate themselves politically, because they had kind of given up on resistance. And I think there's reason to believe that the Israeli government might have known about it, maybe could have even helped it. I don't think there's literally Hamas and Mossad are planning this together. We're going to fuck our own people this way. But but I do believe that there's a confluence of interests here that the Palestinian, that Hamas as ruling the Gaza section had needed to resuscitate itself, and saw this act as partly doing that, as well as trying to launch a larger Arab resistance they were hoping. And I do think, my guess now is that the Israeli government did know October 7th was going to happen and said, when these fools do this, we're going to clamp down, and we're clearing the place out after that. We're going to clear out Gaza, and we're going to clear out the West Bank. And that's where I think we are today. But regardless of whether I think it was a good idea or a bad idea, I don't care. They were right to resist, and they did fight back. And whatever you're going to do to try to claw back some dignity and some justice out of this, they have the right to do. And I'm on their side for doing it. And I'm also on their side because it puts a thorn in the heel of the United States, because anything that undermines Israel, which is a proxy of the United States, undermines the U.S. state. And that's where it's going to help me, in terms of playing my role as a revolutionary here.
Yeah, I would say on the question of funding, right? Like, so this is, I don't, so mostly what seems to have happened is that Israel allowed things to happen. Meaning, like, there were some recent, discoveries of funds going from Israel to Qatar, then to, but I would say actually that they were mainly allowed to develop during the height of the, during the height of the nationalist phase of the struggle, or the sort of secular nationalist phase of the struggle, and now, and more recently, after the establishment of the PA and some international recognition of a Palestinian state, was backed specifically by, like, the Netanyahu wing of the Israeli government, because they wanted to destroy any, like you said, they wanted to destroy any hope of a two-state solution. But the most of the funding from Hamas, I would say Hamas is it looks much more like a product of neighboring Arab states,
mm-hmm.
and Iran. Like, and I don't think that those are bad things, but I think that this is a case where the actual impact of funding from the other side it's not, like, I don't see, like, comparing the level of funds they get, like, I don't see how you can say Israel is, like, bankrolling them, right? Certainly Israel could have prevented money from reaching them, right? And that's the main accusation, is that they let Qatar essentially get money into, and not just directly to Hamas, but, like, into Gaza at all, right? So there was a blockade, and Israel knew there was funds going in from Qatar, right? And that's the main explosive accusation, right? But most of the funding that comes to Hamas is from Iran, Gulf states, diaspora charities, so it's, anyway. So but the point of raising that argument is to say that I think we have to see Hamas essentially as going through a somewhat natural process, meaning, like, it's not the case that it's somehow bought and paid for and designed by Israel as, like, the perfect enemy to allow Israel to get what it wants.
Yeah.
I do think that the model of, like, what's going on is, like, there's a garden, right? This is the earth is the ruling class's garden, and something grows up, and they try and, like a weed grows, they want to dig it out, they want to get rid of it, but then something else grows. And the reason why that's important is because I don't think I think we have to see something like Hamas as having a class divide within it, right? Like, there's definitely a divide between the leadership who is able to, from its position, make billions of dollars from essentially running the Gaza Strip, and the people on the ground who are very serious about freeing themselves and are giving their bodies to do that. And the material analysis part comes when I think is useful when we see like, so there is a way in which the Hamas leadership does benefit from this current relationship, in the sense that the leadership is now the primary force that Israel has to negotiate with, right? So they're negotiating with, who are they else are they negotiating with? They're negotiating with Hamas, right? When aid comes in, like Hamas does have a position in it, but I think that that's fundamentally different. That position of the leadership is fundamentally different than the position of the most of the people who make up the base in Hamas. And even without supporting October 7th or not, saying nothing of, just looking at what happened before and after October 7th. October 7th disrupted Israeli normalization with the Gulf states. Like, it was about to happen. Like, they were about to basically be like, okay, fine. We'll basically normalize trade with you, Israel. And so the attack did disrupt that, right? Suddenly. And so if we stack up like things that were, I'm glad that happened, right? I'm glad that it's a thorn in the U.S.'s side, but that's mainly like public opinion worldwide, and policies drove a wedge between like the Arab states and the Arab people, and Israel, and relations with Israel even more. But on the other hand, it completely destroyed Gaza. It's a disaster for people of Gaza. Like, Gaza's like unlivable, right? And it's a good question, I think, to ask. Did they foresee that this was going to be the cost of that, right? And what does that mean? Like, I do think that it's a worthwhile question to be like, what does it mean that in order to make some political gains, Hamas is essentially saying, we know you're going to collectively punish the entire population, and that politically we're going to use to basically gain sympathy, right? That's what it looks like happened to me. Like, not like not to like judge it, but like those are the outcomes. Like,
Well, that's the question I want to get to, but Eduardo, you have not had a chance to speak at all. So let's see if you have something to say about any of this stuff, because I think where Michael's going is the place that I'm going to take our conversation to a different place as a springboard to. You'll see.
I mean, the only thing I can gather from what I have been reading, and I have my own summary list of points. I think that that there has been an attempt to have Hamas be the movement for the Palestinian people, but it has been overwhelmingly taken over by elite class and even wealthy families that have been part of a Hamas group, and doesn't represent the people. And I just don't think it's a working class movement, and has good intentions, but has become mostly the party that has been just the default in Gaza, and the PA in the West Bank. And unfortunately, it's what represents the Palestinian people. Of course, they're going to have anger for the occupation of the land. And if they see movement from folks like Hamas trying to protect them, they're going to cheer for that, because they have been oppressed by the Israelis for so long. And so it's interesting to note that in 2020, was it 2023? Yeah, the 7th of October. Prior to that, support for Hamas was waning, according to the article. And then it just gained back that support after the 7th of October. Now, regardless if the 7th of October was something that was actually conspired by the Israeli government or not, we see constant negotiation ceasefires that Israel has sabotaged. and that's being mentioned. And I think the article gives a good overview of the chronological order of how these things have come about and unfolded. And so that's just what I think that first part of what we're discussing just awakens inside me to share. And let's see what you wanted to turn to, Andy.
Well, let me summarize what I think. First of all, everyone who's hearing this should read this article. It's going to be helpful. History. There are some things you may disagree with. Like I was telling Michael that this author thinks of the color revolutions as strictly a popular revolution. I think misses the fact that there's an intersection of popular anger, but definitely the CIA going in those things. And so there are criticisms you can make of things you see within it. But I think as in terms of understanding the origins of Hamas and the origins of these different political groups in there, I think it's very good. And
Yeah,
like you said, you had read other things that largely more confirmed most of the history that that Omar Hassan has written. Let me tell you what I think are the lessons from it, but then let me tell you why I would say Omar Hassan is a socialist. I'm a socialist. Michael's a socialist. Why I would say we shouldn't write articles like this, and I'll get at it, or they should be written differently. So first off, the first one is right of resistance of any occupied people, the right to fight back against their oppressors. That's number one. Number two, and Michael got at it when he said the issue was that these people had to do something to survive, and Hamas made decisions ultimately of moving away from armed resistance in order to, and each of those was a political concession to the goal of right of return of one large democratic. People get the right to return to their land and live in dignity, like with each other, as the way they were prior to when Britain came in 100 years ago and screwed it up. When you give away that thing to survive, you are dead, because there's no survival there. And I think there's a lesson out of this about reform or revolution, that you either make a revolution or you die. If you move away from revolution to survive, you're dead. Not politically dead. They will kill you, because each step, here's how it's going to go down for these people. This was going to happen to them one way or another. They were either going to be put on some fucking train and moved out, right? Get the fuck out peacefully, in the same way that we all talk about Jews getting into trains peacefully and being sent somewhere to die, or they were going to be drummed out this way, and this is the future for these people, because they are working class, and that's the capitalist class, and this is what they have in store for us. So I would say that one of the rules we have to look, the lesson out of this is you either get it all or you lose it all, and there's no middle ground to sustain yourself on. So you have to fight for revolution, regardless. However you think you're going to get there, that's what you have to fight for. You have to fight for the thing you want. And every time you try to concede to it from people who've taken it from you, they're going to take more, and they will take your life inevitably. And I think that's the other lesson I would draw from this. And last, I guess, is political independence. Like a movement, anytime it takes its money from Israel, takes its money from another wing of the capitalist class, it moves you into that place where you're going to be having to give up on your aims. And it's another version of the second rule that I just said, which is they're going to take you from being revolutionary to being compromised, and it will always come at your expense. You think you're gaining something, you're not. You're losing something. And so that, to me, are the three essential rules that you can learn from this struggle. And maybe you guys would disagree with those things, but I'll just say, I don't see any value. The problem I have with this article is I don't see any of us value in us what is it called? Lawyering. What is that called? What lawyers do? Legislating, not litigating. Litigating whether this was the right thing for them to do, whether it was the wrong thing for them to do. And it's not out of who am I to say. It is out of the fact that my role in relationship to this, because this author obviously knows that they're fighting their resistance so that we can build our resistance here. The question I think an article like this has to take up is, how out of this struggle do I build resistance in my country? not what should they be doing. Those folks have to figure it out, and they're going to make all sorts of mistakes. The question is, what do I do to build struggle, resistance to my wing of capitalist empire? And he's got to do that. Like, he's got to figure that out in Australia. And that's the question I have to ask here is, what is the relationship between the events taking place in Palestine, where people are fighting back against an oppressor that is funded by my own government? What is the relationship between that and me building something in my own country? And that is the thing. That is the problem. All these details about Hamas and PLO and Fatah disrupt us from that question. It makes us think about things that I can't really know. It makes us even think about, should October 7th have happened or not? It's not my business. Of course, it's my business. I care about the working class there, just as we're an international working class. But it is not my business to decide. My business is to figure out, in your struggle over there, how do I use that to build my struggle? Because if I can build my struggle, then if I can build my struggle, I may have actual solidarity to share for you. I may have solidarity to give to you. If I have nothing, if there's nothing I can build over here, I have no solidarity to offer. We cannot speak of solidarity without me being part of something that is taking on my own ruling class, because that solidarity is in relationship to the trouble that it's making to my ruling class. And if I don't do that, then there's nothing. I'm not offering anything other than opinion, and that's wrong, and that's not helping. Like, in fact, it's actually a distraction from what I need to be doing. So I guess I'll start there in saying that this article, as much as I find it useful, I actually think is the wrong thing for me to be reading. Like, or rather, what I should be writing is, okay, they got the right to resistance. They're resisting over there. I don't know what was right or wrong about it, but it's happening, and it's going to continue to happen because the U.S. is counting on Israel to be its proxy, and the U.S. is going to use that proxy to push its war aims there, and it's going to continue to fight China, build its war aim against Russia over there. Imperialist war is going to occur. How do I turn imperialist war abroad into civil war at home, right? So the question is, what is the relationship between those events and me trying to build that civil war here? And if I'm not thinking more about what's the difficulty I have in building civil war, then I think I'm off the rails.
Yeah, I would just say that I agree that the discussion of, like, was it a good idea or a bad idea? Let's advise the Palestinians on how they struggle. That is not, if I said anything that if I said anything, well, I'm just saying, like, for myself, if I ever said anything that seems like I'm trying to advise the Palestinians on how to do their struggle, then I am sorry, because I cannot even imagine the things that they eat, whether you're Fatah or Hamas. I can't even imagine the just the years of waiting people went through, seeing so many people die, the level of repression. Like, I have nothing but respect for people who are standing up to themselves. And to your point earlier, the fact that they fought back opens a crack, opens a vulnerability in my government. In fact, and that is why I can say, I think that overall, when people fight back, it helps everyone. It helps the global working class. Like, I agree with that. I do think that when people come in to a movement in the climate of demonization, they have questions, right? And there are real. I do think it is important for us to have some kind of coherent narrative that connects events together, right? Like, the whole thing about, like, rather, I'll say that political questions like, is Hamas a psyop? Is a real question. Like, people really kind of believe that. Or on the other hand, is Hamas the vanguard of the entire global struggle right now, right? Like, there's a passivity in saying that, like, they're the ones who are going to do it for us. And then that is a real strain within the movement. Like, shut up, don't, wait for directions, right? There's the glorification, right? And lifting people up on a pedestal is also an excuse to turn your brains off, right? So I agree that this is not the kind of thing that is going to necessarily help us build, stronger solidarity in the near term. But I do think that having an like a dynamic model of the world is very important. And the thing that I guess, the thing that I'd say is like Hamas grew from genuine resistance. They tried to co-opt it. It's not the same. It's not the same as one of the color revolutions where the leaders were literally like trained in the US and then sent to be the leaders. Like Zelensky was literally on a, was literally on a TV show funded by the US to play a president before then they helped rig an election to make him president. That is a different story than what Hamas is, right? So this idea that the feds go and start all these things and they're somehow in control of everything, like does not explain why Hamas actually won an election, right? Hamas actually won the election, and by all accounts, it was actually an election. It was a huge day. It was and maybe we can say the election that Hamas won was completely rigged. It was completely made up. Like that is not actually what most people say on the ground. Hamas actually did win a popular election. Hamas did not back down on the right to armed resistance. Hamas, was essentially from 2006 to 2007, like Fatah and the PA were locking them up and torturing them, right? So it seems much more a better model to me that there's a split within the Palestinian movement about which world power to orient to. Are we orienting towards the non-aligned countries like BRICS, or are we orienting towards basically the UN and the United States, which is so that understanding that dynamic in a realistic sense is going to help us, I think, understand near-term events. But I also agree that because we're so actually disconnected from like real struggle on the ground, that we mostly end up talking about ideas like this instead of practical things. So, when at the end of the article, there's this thing about, in contrast to sordid dealings, a genuinely revolutionary resistance would have understood that the fate of Palestine lay with the fate of these revolutions talking about the Arab Spring, right? So this guy is essentially advising the Palestinians. To bring it back, I guess it's like we have to kind of be able to know what's actually going on. And I think that part of it is cutting against the demonization, the dehumanization. It's like people get into these situations because they're posed very stark choices. And I don't think, and the other question is like, does this look like Israel's about to fall? No. Because of my assessment of what Hamas represents, it does not represent the kind of force that is going to, so maybe that's a limited amount of value. Like maybe that's too limited to justify this kind of slippery slope we're going down. But
I'll try to make my point more plain. If this is a 3,000 word article, then I think you get 500 words to talk about Palestine. The other 2,500 he's got to be talking about Australia. That's what I mean. If that's not happening, and I don't blame him, because the reality is all of us right now have been advising Palestine because we're spending time talking about Hamas. We're spending time talking about Fatah. Like, look, we can't help it. Like, because we have wandered into a conversation that doesn't involve the actual thing we need to be doing. And and that's why I started with saying he's a socialist in Australia, because if I was re-advising a fellow socialist, I'd say, can you rewrite this and condense your part about Hamas to clarify some stuff in about 500 words, and then the other 2,500 about what is the situation, what does this mean for the working class in Australia? What does it mean if you're on a campus, maybe he's on a campus, what does it mean in relationship to the student movement and the working class and that kind of thing? I imagine if that's a very difficult question to answer because he's not connected to anything, well, then that's the thing you got to talk about. because then you have nothing. So why are any of us, because I'm not connected to anything, you kind of are connected to something. Why are any of us talking about Hamas and Fatah and PLO and Sykes-Picot and whatever, when we have nothing to offer materially? We have nothing. Our real problem is we got to figure out, but there is something happening in the world that might make it possible to build something. And that is what we need to write about, because we have nothing. We have to spend time thinking about how we're going to build something. That is the task. That's what I'm going to say. And I would actually say that this discussion in many ways reflects and mirrors the what the left has, and the revolutionary left has done to itself. It's made us all people who are like from the Center for Strategic and International Studies, like Rand Corporation people, but on the left. Like, we're talking about the world, but we are not really spending time talking about the thing. How is this related to how we're trying to change our world directly around us? And I guess I don't know what to do about that, except to say that I think that might be a problem.
That I think that might be a problem.
I mean, I think what this author could have done was compare that the the Palestinian struggle to what's happening on the ground in Australia. And I mean, I was thinking as we were talking about this, and I appreciate this being like a workstation kind of almost study group, because as we have looked at this article and read it, you both probably finished it, I didn't, and we trying to do a lot of homeworks in my life these days. I think about our analysis, and I try to think about, I'm not in Australia, I'm in North America, I'm currently in Mexico, but I think of the Mexican struggle and the US American struggle to be tied, because we're neighbors. And I am also a US American by nationality, and I have an interest in what's happening in US American politics. And so when I think about the history and what we're building and what has been, what political movements have taken place in the USA, I think about the revolutionary visions of, let's say, if I just to pick one, the Black Panther Party, and how it became, just like the Palestinian struggle, became a first revolutionary struggle to overthrow capitalism, dismantle um, the authoritarian rule. There were anti-colonial struggles that were influenced by Marxism in that struggle. I mean, there's a whole thing that we can discuss about Black Panther. I'm not going to do it at this moment. And then I see how they had militant action and armed resistance, and they were famous for their armed patrols and where they monitored police interactions for police brutality. How the FBI then was also surveillancing them, and there was infiltration, violent attacks to destabilize and destroy the Panthers. And after that, there was so much state repression that they started to take people as I would say political prisoners.
Yeah.
And over time, they became from an armed resistance to shifting their resistance to more of a community programs. And I think that they were quite successful in those community programs. They focused on free breakfast for children and community self-defense and educational programs and legal aid and la la la. But after that, I think there were deep divisions. And this is where I think we have to figure out what we want in our movements, because the Black Panther Party became a reformist party after that. I mean, if we look at what was it? I was trying to figure out who ran for mayor in Oakland, which was part of Bobby Seale, one of the key members of the Black Panther Party. And instead of continuing the guerrilla armed resistance, now you had them integrating themselves into more electoral politics and social programs and mainstream alliances, which is what happens when you allow any sort of movement be co-opted by the governing class that is present, whether Democrat or Republican. And they did that with the Black Lives Matter movement as well. I remember you shared with me, Andy, that you and Kenny had gone to one of the rallies at the Black Lives Matter movement in SF, and they were talking about electoral politics, and they were focusing the energy of the crowd to focus on just voting and the electoral and who you had to vote for. And I think we forget how these struggles commence. And that's why I'm mentioning it, because of that deep divide with, if we look at the Black Panther movement, there was the Newton faction reformist group, and then there was a Cleaver faction revolutionary group, which I think that's the way they should have gone. So they came at a fork in the road. You either went with Huey Newton, who was released from prison in 1970, and they focused on those electoral politics, social programs stuff, or you were going to take on the road of Eldridge Cleaver and his supporters that advocated for continued armed struggle and international guerrilla warfare, which is the way to be in solidarity with Palestinians. And that's something that we've discussed in the past. It's fighting on U.S. American soil against U.S. imperialist class, the government, to be in solidarity with other revolutionary movements abroad. And unfortunately, the Newton faction reformist path was the most popular one, because I think people don't know how to keep themselves out of that paradigm of how do we affect change. And I think that's the question that even give me his name at this time, Andy, Michael
Caine.
Michael Caine has even asked the question. If not electoral politics, if not campaigning, political campaigning, and if not voting in for people that are speaking for the people, as he said that RFK Jr. was doing, then what is the alternative? And that's the question I think we are trying to answer. And I appreciate you, Andy, for shaking us a bit and calling us out and asking us to reconsider and reanalyze this article and think about how this applies to us wherever we're at. I mean, I guess I was caught myself in this article as we studied it, and how much information has been unpacked about the Palestinian struggle and the chronological order of all the history that has unfolded for us. And that's great to understand what's happening in Israel and Palestine. But you are right to ask us the question of, how does it have any meaning for us in our lives today? And as Kenny would say, if he was here, our former co-host, I'm not sure where he's at these days, for us to not just think about theory, but rather to think about how, whether it be Marxist um, economics or revolutionary thought, apply to our real lives and to working people. So I guess I was just trying to look into U.S. American movements that have taken the more reformist approach, and I thought of the Black Panther movement at this time. And I think that what we're trying to build now, and what I was sharing last night in the episode with Jacob, is that we should be building something. And I re-emphasized constantly in last night's episode, which I invite people to watch on Bantercast Live, that I don't have anything against the MAGA folk. I don't have anything against Trump supporters. I think I have everything against the cultism that they have uh, constructed around Trump. And I think that there is a, what do you call it, sedation? Not sedation, a thirst for real change in the country. And but I think that we should be focusing on. But anyhow, those are the things that came to mind as I'm thinking out loud.
Well, I'm going to say this about what you did, Eduardo. because I do think there's a connection between the lessons to learn from the Black Panther Party and maybe the lessons to be learned here. And what you did a pretty darn good job just from the top of your head making those connections. Socialists would do that all the time. The reason we would do that is because we spent a lot of time in school, and this is the kind of thing that English teachers would ask us to write essays on. Compare and contrast these two things. In reality, and this I am putting it to me and Michael, because me and Michael come from a tradition in which we insist there's a connection between theory and practice. And once you spend your time doing things like figuring out how you might compare the Black Panther Party to the Hamas or what's going on in Palestine, or once you spend your time trying to really familiarize yourself with Palestinian history and to answer some of these questions that do come up in the movement here in the United States when you're trying to build resistance, I feel like you can start to disconnect theory and practice, and that is the thing that I'm accusing us socialists of doing. And this is one of the manifestations of it, is the fact that he wrote a damn good article that gave me a lot of information, and yet I actually think, if I think about it, it's actually harmful to the cause that both Michael and I have dedicated ourselves to, which is the working class liberation of society through through what we think Marxism is a guide, as a method, and if it is, then I'm putting forward the idea that for us, those who call ourselves Marxists, these kind of articles should not be written any longer. They should be articles that answer questions that are in your movement, and you're using that other place to answer that question. So he's going to pull one of the political threads that you gain out of that to try to strengthen a movement that he's building here, which means you're really talking about Australia. Like, and if you're an Australian socialist talking about there, and you're not talking about Australia, then I don't know what you're talking about. So that's what I'm getting at. And we have such a problem with academic training that I think we think like, oh, we've been taught how to write about these things. So some of the things even you're saying, Eduardo, remind me more of what an English teacher would tell me to do rather than what I think we need to do for our struggle. And I know that's not a bad thing, but I'm saying for Marxists, we are trying to change the world, not just understand it. And in order to do that, and if we think theory is going to be a guide, then theory has to be tested against practice. And so if we're not talking about our situation, then we're disconnecting it from practice. So Michael, please feel free to respond to that, I guess.
I think the audience for this is actually a debate within the movement, but he doesn't name by name or actually give substance to the people who he's arguing with. Because I think the purpose of having an analysis like this is to help win an argument within the movement, to focus on broader layers of people, in particular the working class. Right? It's basically like, look, Hamas has a complicated process, but they are not going to save us. We have to organize here. I mean, that is like a very real argument.
But do you see that in this article is written? This is article. If I didn't know better, I would say he's a socialist in Palestine, because that's what fit for me.
Right.
He's a socialist in Palestine, talking about two socialists in Palestine about the way forward, and Hamas bourgeois nationalists. This is not what's going to build it. And in regards to that, he's going to have to speak to what is our situation? What is our situation in relationship to the working class? What's our hearing? Then I could see talking about all that stuff.
Right.
But I don't see, I don't think his audience, this is not an important debate for, I would actually say the only thing that might be if I was thinking about a campus in the United States is the idea of the right of resistance. That's about it. But then what do you do with that? And how do you build out of that? That's where I would go. But really, you're saying, it comes back to what you started with, Michael. You would just go on a big screed about your own ruling class. You would, and then you'd have to take it all the way back.
To me, this kind of article is for a comradely debate, where you are talking about actually specific things that are happening within the movement. And I will say that the right to resist within the movement as it exists is not the big that's not the big question. There's not like some, pacifist wing of the Palestinian rights movement now. Like that's not where things are at. So like I think you're not quite aware of how the the identity politics as it's reemerged, anti-racist politics essentially makes any person of a certain identity or oppressed class into a something that is uncriticizable. But that means that if you're not of that class, then you are essentially waiting for them to tell you what to do. And basically part of why we want to understand what Hamas actually represents is to say that, one, we have to defend their right to resist and understand the organic nature of resistance that they represent, and also that they're not gonna tell us what to do. They can't. They also don't even. There's a question of like, do they even have the same interests as our working class, right? Which that doesn't matter, except that we have to focus on building things here in a way that's going to last. That's not just ideological, because I guess this is the thing that I feel like could be more, if I was going to write the next article, it'd be like, look, this person in the movement is making this argument. I think it's based on this. I think this is the other argument, but it also doesn't make that much sense for me to write an article like that unless I have some significant presence in the movement, some significant organized base. So in that sense, Andy, I agree that there's no, if you don't represent shit on the ground, then this is just academic, discussion, right? And so who's the audience is important, right? Who's the audience that we're talking to? If I'm talking to someone who thinks Hamas is evil and Hamas, is just as bad as Israel, which is probably the predominant view. The predominant view is that Hamas and Israel are both really bad. We don't like either of them. Fuck them both, And I was like, yeah, okay, but did you know the U.S. is actually way worse? And like the things that you think look really bad about Hamas are basically like came out of, very, very desperate situations for those people. And that what we have to do, you know what I'm saying? Like part of the organizing process, to me, I become more convinced of is that we have to knit together intellectuals who are in debate about the movement. But also we have to have a significant layer of productive intellectuals who can actually accurately interpret and connect the events. And again, if they're not disciplined by a movement, we know what happens. But do we need actual intellectual work to basically cut through the lies and provide a coherent narrative to the past? Yeah, I don't see, otherwise it's the bourgeois narrative is there, right? We have to have a separate narrative, one that's rooted in class analysis, right? And so what I think that our tradition has done is tried to basically argue a class analysis to all, try and understand any key historical events, key historical players through a lens of class analysis. And that's what I think this article is trying to do. But I also agree with you that it's disconnected from real practice. It's taking up an argument without actually addressing who exactly is the argument with in Australia, who exactly is the argument with, and what are the consequences of that debate, right? It's just an academic thing. So that's kind of where I'm at with things. We need intellectuals, but maybe without a movement, it's pointless. without people who can build a base. But I know that if I didn't know what I was talking about and just avoided people's questions, be like only talked about, well, we need to fight our own government, like I don't think people would be motivated. Like if you still have questions, like if you can't convince me that the stuff that the ruling class has been telling me about Hamas is like not real, then that's connected to the question of should I oppose U.S. aid to Israel? I have colleagues who basically were like, I don't want to call for a ceasefire because or I don't want to call for an arms embargo because if Israel didn't get some of the weapons, a lot of innocent Israelis might die. Like that's literally an argument that gets made, right? So I don't see how we can get around having knowing what we're talking about when it comes to Hamas. And again, I'm skewed in the direction of ideas because the largest action we can muster is like a little walkout of 50 people, and we might have like a rally on May Day later of a few thousand, but
Right.
5 people come to our meetings.
I'm never going to be a person who says, well, it's just better to be ignorant. I'm not saying that.
Right.
I'm suspicious. I'm suspicious of
Yeah.
this kind of article. This is what we were literally raised on it.
Yeah.
And we've read thousands of articles like this, which have had what I would say meaningful historical information, meaningful in terms of, okay, I'm now more educated about this. But I also know we are at a deep impasse in terms of the revolutionary tradition. Like we are deeply fucked. And I don't think we got there by accident. And I wonder sometimes if stuff like this is partly how we've arrived at this point where we are completely powerless now because we've literally become heads in a jar with no bodies to move ourselves. Because that's what these articles remind me of. This is what organizing would be like if I was just a head in a jar. If I didn't intend to move my body and do something with it. And we so little expect out of what we write. And Eduardo, when I say we, I mean us Marxists, and this is why I'm glad Michael is here. And I'm thinking about the ISO and I'm thinking about our tradition. We so little think about what does this mean for what I do tomorrow for trying to pinky in the brain, take over the world, right? And in my little corner. And the fact that it's hard for me to even think about what it would be indicates, in my opinion, an educational. I've gotten one kind of education at the expense of the kind of education I actually needed. That's what I would say. So again, I'm just suspicious of something like this, and not suspicious like he's an op, but it's like because he did some fucking good research, but I just question now what we should be doing and what the balance should be in relationship to information about stuff like this. And I know you're not, because you are saying it's counter to the narrative, the propaganda that's being used by the ruling class to split us off. So you do need something. You do need something to resist that. But I sometimes question how much we put that in the realm of ideas and so much disconnect it from, okay, what am I doing with this as a means of guiding what I'm trying to build here so I can actually offer the international struggle some kind of solidarity? Because like you said, we can't until I becomes we. Yeah. And unless I have a we to be part of, I'm just nothing. I'm offering nobody anything except for like a tweet or an email.
Or a podcast.
Oh, you had to say the truth hurts, man. The truth hurts.
Yeah, man. I mean, we're in a bad spot.
Yeah.
And I guess I think it's not like articles like this are the reason. You know what I'm saying? Like maybe there's a grain in. I mean, but but does it reflect the fact that the left in the United States has been, through intense coercion, intense violence, and masterful co-optation, completely disarmed? I mean, I'm dealing with, I just, when I read stuff like this, it's like, oh, thank goodness, someone to talk to who like remembers something. Like
Yeah.
I mean, how many people know anything about this history? Like beyond, a meme or like you know, a short YouTube video, maybe. People don't. People have been severed from history and from a method for integrating history into understanding the world today. And to me, that's part of this is at least part of the tradition that tries to do that.
Yeah.
That it's not saying, it's not saying, don't do anything.
Mhm.
It's saying we can understand past events in a framework that helps us understand what's going on today. Capitalism is in the saddle. Capitalism is in control. It's in control of Hamas. Hamas is capitalist. They're capitalists.
And I
And this dynamic may have to do with that. And most importantly, everything that we are up against is controlled by capitalists in our own country.
Right. But I do think it says don't do anything ultimately, because it doesn't talk
Okay.
about what socialists in Australia should be doing or their situation. And so that message, like, and we've all been guilty of it. So ultimately, because it doesn't come back to what Omar will be doing, it does say do nothing, in my opinion.
Right.
And I'm not saying that firmly. I'm kind of just throwing that out there, not as a devil's advocate, but as this kind of path that I'm thinking about right now that's different than what I've been trained to do.
So I want to raise the first sentence with you because to me, the first sentence is highly significant. As someone who, maybe this is, maybe there's some projection or substitution going on here. But when he says the new Nakba taking place in Gaza has made it clearer than ever that the struggle for Palestine is a struggle against the entire system of capitalism and imperialism in the Middle East. That is actually true for a new layer of people.
No, it's not.
It is true for a small new layer of people.
Episode 3. This is episode 3 now. That is not. It's a lie. It's a lie that he goes against when he talks about this has been taken over by bourgeois nationalists. He's lying to himself because he can't do anything. He wants to make himself feel better, that there's a possibility of change out of this. And that's not true, because there is no working class that's organized towards that sees itself as a working class for itself. That's what needs to be built in Australia. That's what needs to be built in the United States. He knows this doesn't exist because he's not even talking about that. He's not even talking about the Australian capitalist class, let alone the Australian working class. So unless you connect, if you believe that, then you better be able to connect it to your working class in Australia, if that's a true statement. But it isn't a true statement. It's a lie. It's
Right.
a lie that we tell ourselves so we can sleep better at night. Because that's not the situation right now. Of course, capitalism produces the possibility out of crisis. This is an expression of that crisis, but let's look at the actual situation we are in. And so that was where I wanted to go to episode 3 to talk about the boilerplate stuff in the beginning. So you've kind of got me to the next episode to talk about that. But I want to say that people should read this article. And maybe we'll come back to round 3.
Yeah.
Into that question. You kind of
Yeah. I mean, I would just add that it's become clearer than ever for a specific radicalized layer of people who are either going into like some movement they have access to, or may become even more disillusioned. So like, be made it clearer than ever to who is my question to this author, because I do experience firsthand the difference, the change in people who are now very hungry for an explanation about why is this happening, and very responsive to and connect the dots between that international capitalism requires this kind of thing to maintain its dominance.
Look, he put it in this
Yeah.
way. It is the struggle for against the entire system of capitalism and imperialism in the Middle East. Look, I'm in the United States. My struggle against imperialism is not in the Middle East. It's here. My government has to be defeated in war, and out of its defeat in war, we must make a revolution take place. That's it.
Yeah.
So his thing is not just a lie; it's a misdirection to where you should direct people to. He has to talk about how Australian
In the Middle
imperialism will
East,
come
yeah.
down as a result of this. The people fighting against imperialism in the Middle East are Palestinians. I'm not fighting the imperialism in the Middle East. I'm fighting
Palestinians, Lebanese,
right with those
Syrians.
folks, right?
Yeah.
So that's he's wrong, and he doesn't even know who he's talking to. He doesn't believe it anyway, so he just wrote it.
That's right.
And so if he really believed it, he would be accurate in what he said. But he threw it off as a statement to just be like, "Here's my Marxist passport, where I want to prove to you that I'm writing this." So I put this in the as well. But I don't. It's not true, and the way he said it is wrong. And if he was being accurate, he would have talked about the Australian imperialism, if you will, or the imperialism of the West, or really, fighting the Australian capitalist class. And then he would have come up against the fact that there's absolutely no struggle taking place within Australia around the Australia. And then he would have been faced with the absurdity of saying that right now capitalism is faced with this blah 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 blah, because he knows that's not happening. That's why he doesn't say it. So he can speak of some other place that maybe gives him hope that it might be happening, because it's far away from him. And that's the exact problem. So maybe we don't have to have episode 3. That's basically what I was going to say anyway.
I don't fully disagree with that. Now that I see, just the phrase at the end, in the Middle East, he's talking about, and then he talks about like, we're building protests and stuff, but it's true. There's no, it's like a thing that's happening over there.
Yeah.
And then therefore his appeals for action are essentially kind of like moral.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they're
Which I'm
disconnected
also
from
really
anything
sick of.
like you said, your beat right now is this area. So I'm glad we have this episode to discuss this kind of thing. For you, it could have been true, like if this was written by an American socialist who was on a campus, like and there was an anti-occupation movement going on there. There could have been a real relationship between what they got to do and what you got to do. But for me, I'm still dealing with like what we talked about before. The issue I'm dealing with in my site is immigration and AI. And so my way of dealing with the solidarity that I have to the Palestinian struggle is shutting down ed tech and getting it out of education. Like that would be like, and that's connected to Lavender and WhatsApp, where's daddy, it's so he believes that everyone's got to be part of the Palestinian blah, blah, blah. That's wrong. Like, because we're all in different struggles right now that are connected, but we're connected in different ways.
Yeah.
So, but it would have been much more valuable for him to speak of the actual slice of the place where he was at and what it meant for him. So maybe for you, Michael Hoffman, if you were also on a campus and did it, then you would say, okay, yeah, I can see that. Or we have a different thing going on here in the United States. And so I got to do it a little differently than what he's saying, or, but there would be, I think, even if he talked about those things, there'd be lessons in it for me, because we're all in a pretty isolated situation.
No, and actually, I'm glad Eduardo brought up the Black Panther Party. We should do a different, we could do episodes on that. I highly recommend Black Against Empire as a book right. But so like my method is I read these things and I'm constantly thinking about what do they tell me about the struggle in the United States? Like the questions of reform or revolution, to me, really do shine through in this universal way. I mean, and that's part of the importance of talking about the history, is like, these are people. They're not like subject to some completely different other political laws, right? So like, just seeing the connections between the way that a powerful ruling class will force you to compromise and then use that compromise as a lever to make you forget about what your goals were, right? And as soon as you, so this leads me to like what I think is a big question that I have is that through compromise, if you give up the long-term goal, you're definitely dead, right? But is there a way in which survival, also with honesty, right? Saying like, we're going to capitulate right now.
Yeah.
Because we don't have the material forces and we don't want everyone to be murdered, you know. But, you know, we're going to keep. But the ultimate goal is complete liberation and revolution, right? And to me, that's the dynamic that this raises.
We're trying to like
right?
fucking
Right. So Hamas is just, another political movement that became integrated into the system and has those same problems.
Yep.
You got a base of people that has different interests than the people at the top, and it's hard because imperialism is fucking brutal. Right? It's so that's why I read. I mean, I read things like this and I try and integrate it into everything else that I'm thinking about.
Yep.
And to me, that question of reform or revolution really is the big thing I get out of studying this history.
Yep.
And also just respect and humility for other people's struggles.
Yep.
And because if you don't know anything about it, then you substitute the imagination provided for you by the ruling class. But yeah, this bullshit of we have to build, everyone should be involved. It's like you only believe that because it's a season, right? So like in terms of our political training, it's like we're hopping on whatever movement is big, and we'll pretend like it's the most important thing while it's going on. And then when no one else is there, we'll be like, okay, whatever. Because we're just, riding the waves of popular opinion.
Yeah. Well, I think, Eduardo, if you have any last thoughts, I'm done. I appreciate what you said, Michael. And I'll leave it at that because this has been very helpful.
That's good for me. And I appreciate you being on this with us, Michael. You make me think a lot about what is next for us as what's left to discuss on different matters of what you're bringing up. So anyhow, thank you. And I think we have found a good place for us to conclude this week's episode. That does it for this week's episode. What's Left is a weekly political podcast /channel challenge the mainstream left. We post information about our topics and our guests on the episode notes wherever you found this episode or on our blog on Whatsleftpodcast.com. You can find past episodes to this podcast /channel there and connect with us. I remind folks, if you like anything you heard here, please subscribe, rate, if you turn on your notifications to any of our platforms on the Spotify, iTunes podcasts, BitChute, Odyssey, YouTube, Rumble, or Telegram. You can find our blog and any of those links in the episode notes wherever you found this episode, except on YouTube, because we have to include links with all kinds of obstacles. If you would like to give us feedback about something you've heard or suggest something for us to cover, contact us through our blog. I'm Eduardo Barca with Andy Lipson and Michael Hoffman. Thank you all for listening and check us out next week. Ciao.
Bye-bye.
Bye.